Rappin' with ReefBum is sponsored by Bulk Reef Supply and Ecotech Marine.
Need a NASA-style countdown here.
It is a NASA-style countdown. Hey, what's happening, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Rappin' with ReefBum. I'm your host, Keith Berkelhamer. So today, I have the pleasure of welcoming back Dr. Eli Meyer to the show from AquaBiomics. What's up there, Eli?
Hello, good to see you.
So we had Eli on a couple of months ago. We had some technical difficulties. We believe that those technical difficulties have been worked out because there's been a change in venue for
right.
Eli.
New laptop, new internet connection. Hopefully everything behaves.
Yes. We think we're gonna have some good mojo for this live stream. For those,
you can see I'm actually in the lab here. You can see the PCR machine right behind me there. The heart of AquaBiomics.
There you go. There you go. Just a little bit background on Eli. He is a coral biologist and aquarium hobbyist, and he owns AquaBiomics. AquaBiomics can analyze the microbiome of an aquarium using DNA sequencing, so they can diagnose issues and identify strategies for promoting a healthy microbiome in an aquarium. And so before we start chatting and getting into the conversation with Eli, I want to thank the sponsors for the show, both Bulk Reef Supply and Ecotech Marine. I really appreciate them supporting and sponsoring the show. And as always, I appreciate you folks tuning in. And please spread the word about the stream. Hit that like button to get more people into the stream. And if you wouldn't mind subscribing to the channel, that would be awesome. So, folks, thanks for tuning in. I see that we got a bunch of people in the chat and on the stream here. So as always, feel free to drop comments and questions in the chat. So Eli, I think pretty much where we were in our conversation the last time a couple months ago in August was we were kind of getting into the nitty gritty of the results that you guys have analyzed for my 187 gallon tank, right?
Yeah, you got this nice before and after series samples before you added some rock and after. It looks like we saw some real changes.
Yeah. So I've got data from three different tests that three different samples that I sent in to you guys. So let me just kind of like lay the groundwork in terms of what my situation was, and I've talked about this before, but just to kind of like summarize it. About 3 months ago, I completely swapped out the Haitian live rock, about 125 pounds of Haitian live rock that I had in my 187 gallon reef tank. And, it was a very mature reef tank. It was about 5 years old. It was packed with corals. The Haitian live rock was completely encrusted with coral. I would say 95% of the surface of the rock that was facing the light was encrusted with coral. So, I made the call. It was a very tough call because it was a beautiful, mature reef tank to do the reboot on the tank, because it was a situation where I was getting so much growth and corals were kind of choking each other out. I was getting a lot less flow in that tank. So there was a little STN going on at some of the base of the corals, but I mean, it was a healthy tank. I mean, there was no doubt about it. It was thriving. So
it's a good problem to have in a lot of ways.
It is a good problem to have, and I'm not complaining by any means. But so and I'm a coral farmer. So I wanted to have more real estate to grow corals. I think I had probably at that point in time about 11 mature colonies in the tank, and some of those colonies, I had this tub stellata montipora, which was just ginormous. Let's see if I can get it on the screen right here. It was huge, probably 14 inches across. I had this Cali tort that I think at one point in time I measured to be 18 inches across. So it was great, but it was just kind of like time. I thought it was time to reboot it. So, the question was, man, how do you do that and keep the microbiome intact? And I wanted to swap out the Haitian live rock, given the fact that it was completely encrusted. So it would have been very tough for me to remove the rock, chisel off all the encrusted coral and put it back in. I just felt like it was going to be too much of a disturbance to the tank to do that, and I wasn't quite sure, if I was going to be able to kind of use a chisel to chip off all the coral in that rock.
Yeah.
And I also wanted, it was 125 pounds of live rock and a 187-gallon tank. I wanted a more open aquascape, and places for fish to swim through. So it was kind of always a desire of mine to do that, and I had never had success. Well, the one time I tried using dry rock to start a reef tank, it was a big fail. I made some mistakes along the way, and it was tough, and I had to reboot that tank, which is the same tank that we're talking about, and that's when I put the Haitian live rock in there. So yeah. Anyway, I wanted to so I used this. I picked up some Carib Sea life rock, and my plan was to do basically to get a Rubbermaid tub. I already had a 100-gallon Rubbermaid tub, so I wanted to I wanted to cook the Carib Sea life rock in that Rubbermaid tub for a few months, and I think I ended up doing it for 6 months. And what I did was every week I did a 10%, water change with the established tank water. I also dosed Microbacter 7 on a daily basis, and then I was also dosing the main display tank with Microbacter 7 as well, and I had 2 frag tanks that are still plumbed into the whole system. So so the plan was to do all that, and then I also wanted to put on a cryptic sump. So I wanted to plumb in a cryptic sump, and what I ended up getting was a 50-gallon, basically a black polyurethane box cube, 2 foot by 2 foot by 2 foot, I think is what it measures. And the plan was to put the Haitian live rock from the established tank, pull it out, chip off as much of the coral as I could, and put that in the cryptic sump, and put the cooked Carib Sea life rock into the display tank. And so I think that kind of lays out the situation. And so what I did was, before I did all of that, I submitted some samples with you for the tank before anything was done. So I was kind of like what we're calling the pre-test. And then I think 3-4 months into the cooking the rock in the Rubbermaid tub, I did a sample of that, the Rubbermaid tub sample. So that was the second sample that I submitted to you guys. And then the third sample, I believe, was the post sample, which might have been 2, 3, 4 weeks. I can't recall exactly how long after the final switch was done, but I submitted all that stuff to you. So we had 3 different samples: the pre-test, the Rubbermaid tub sample, and the post-test. And the goal, really, the overriding goal for me, was to see whether or not I was able to maintain the diversity, the microbiome in that whole system, and whether or not the cryptic sump was a good idea. So, and yeah, so we've got a lot of data that I got back from you guys, and I kind of like wanted to go through that. I'm gonna shut up for now, and
yeah.
But I mean, Eli, do you want to add anything to all that?
Yeah, the slides that you made comparing these 3 are really great. Keith's put together these slides that kind of show, different figures from the reports comparing all 3 samples. And boy, hearing you talk about that tank before you did anything to it, adds some context for thinking about what that community looks like in that original tank. I'm struck by just how much of the Vibrionaceae group you had in this group, in this pre-sample.
Should I? So you want me to show the community composition?
If you can show them, yeah, I think it's useful. We'll get into.
Here's the community composition. So this is the I got the pre-test, the Rubbermaid, and the post-test all lined up in here. And so go ahead, Eli. You were talking about specific.
So yeah, the pre-test, as I recall, shows a really high Vibrionaceae composition, right?
Yep.
So kind of a purple, pinkish down at the bottom of the figure. And so this is a group that we pay a lot of attention to because it includes a lot of pathogens, which is not to say your sample had pathogens, but that family, the Vibrionaceae, includes all the Vibrio and all the photobacteria. So some important pathogens. But, you know, it's not a problem to have it in a tank. This group, they're physically associated with the surface of animals, especially cnidarians like corals. And so if you have a tank with a high coral biomass in it, I expect to see a high Vibrionaceae contribution to the community. Some of the coral farms that I've gotten samples from really exemplify this. You know, maybe up to half of the community could be this group.
Wow.
So that was just what was coming into my mind when you were talking about how overgrown those coral colonies were.
Yep.
This really looks like a community of, a microbial community associated with a thriving coral reef community.
So let's now talk about the Rubbermaid tub sample. So it's a lot different in terms of what that composition looks like. Yeah.
Forgive me, I'm going to plug in the computer. I don't have to move anything, so I don't think this is going to cause a problem.
I'm keeping my fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Making sure you got it on power.
I just got that little warning about,
oh boy,
it's going to go into hibernate mode, and I said, let's make sure we catch it before anybody goes hibernation.
Yeah, we don't want you to hibernate there, Eli. Yep. You lost them. Reconnecting. Eli. Yep, we got you back.
We actually recovered. Excellent. Great. Okay, yeah, shouldn't be any problems now. We're plugged in.
Cool.
Make sure the little message went away.
Yeah.
Sorry about this. I'm so much better with other kinds of technology. not video communications, apparently. There we go.
All right.
There's the little indicator I was looking for. Okay.
All right.
We're
So back to community composition. So we had all that Vibrio, and now there's a lot less of that in the Rubbermaid tub. In fact, I barely see any of it.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the Rubbermaid tub, this one really dominated by Rhodobacteriaceae, right? Is that showing up the same on your screen?
Yeah.
The big orange?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this family, again, one of the normal parts of the reef microbiome, the Rhodobacteriaceae are surface-associated microbes. So they're the major component of the biofilm. So not talking here about animal surfaces, but rather the surfaces of rocks, the surfaces of the glass, plastic pipes, that sort of thing. So in this sample, as you may recall, we didn't get a lot of data from your water filter sample. We have sort of an incomplete picture of what that water looked like in the Rubbermaid tub. So we're mostly here looking at the biofilm that was in the, yeah. So definitely less of the Vibrio in this community.
So now, in terms of the post of the 187-gallon display tank, after I did all that, moving around in terms of rock going from the display into the cryptic sump and the carob sea life rock going from the Rubbermaid into the display tank, it seems to be a lot more well balanced. And does that surprise you, or is that something that you would expect given tasks or given the scenario that described before?
Yeah, I mean, given what you described, the length of time that you put these rocks through, and the care that you took with them, this wasn't just an overnight thing, dump in a bunch of bacteria and nutrients and throw them in the tank. It took some time. What we see in these communities is a process of community succession. You start off with some of the early groups that come to dominate the community early. And I think of these as kind of analogous to grass or shrubs in a terrestrial community. You know, if you go out and clear cut an area, it'll start with grass and it'll progress to shrubs and eventually progress to a mature old growth forest community, right? And that forest community will be very stable and will last in that condition for a long time. My point in that analogy is just to talk about that there are some early groups and some later groups, right? Well, what we see in these microbial communities is it takes some time for this balance to happen in the community. Early on, you frequently have a community that's dominated by one or two groups, and they'll be characteristically kind of early groups, things like Rhodobacteriaceae and some other groups that we haven't seen much of in your tank. But in a mature tank, we see, as you were saying, kind of a balance among the different groups and kind of a characteristic pattern where the major families are the same in every mature reef tank we look at. You know, we have Pelagibacteriaceae, that pink group. We have Rhodobacteriaceae, that orange group. We should have some Vibrionaceae, this kind of pink-purple group down at the bottom. And up at the top, we should have a red band for the Alteramonaceae. So there's this handful of major families that's really characteristic of a mature reef tank. And we're seeing that in this tank that you've achieved by carefully growing the microbes over a span of months.
Yeah, I mean, obviously this is a sample of one, right? I mean, it's just one. Sure, it's just one reef tank. But you know, to me, what it says to me is that, and we're going to look at a bunch of other data here, but I'm just kind of want to say a couple of things based on the community composition. You know, one to me is that longer the better, no matter what you're talking about with a reef tank. You know, so in terms of like cooking rock in established tank water, you know, can you accomplish those goals in 2 weeks, in 4 weeks, in 6 weeks? I mean, I cooked it for 6 months, and again, I'm a sample of one, so I'm not going to like say, you know, people cook your rock for 6 months because it worked for me. Based on what you've seen, have you seen any similar types of data with this sort of scenario in terms of people like cooking live or cooking dry rock to make it live rock? And, you know, if so, have you seen success with people doing it for a much shorter period of time?
Yeah, it's a good question. I can't think of anybody else who's done, you know, maybe somebody in the comments is going to call me out and say, hey, I actually did that. I can't recall anyone who's done this experiment of sort of seeding rock that initially doesn't have a microbial community, seeding it and growing that, you know, over a period of time like this. What I can think of is at least one other example of somebody who had kind of a similar goal, that is to transfer a microbial community intact from an existing tank to a new tank. And mutual friend Andy or Lexenvert, you might know him as, you know, he transferred his microbial community to a new tank really impressively in a short span of time. So kind of a contrast on the timing point, but the same overall goal of, you know, transfer the community intact using rock and water from the original tank. Yeah, at some point I would love to sit down and really compile the data that we have in hand to answer questions like that, because, you know, when I get asked a question like that, we're relying on my memory. But of course, if I could sit down and look at the 1,000 or so samples we've tested, there may be a half a dozen that we could put a good story together.
Now, you know, the other thing I should say is that with all the transfers in terms of pulling all those mature colonies out and transferring them to the frag tanks that were plumbed into the system, fragging the crap out of a lot of the corals, and planting new frags into the display tank. I mean, you know, knock on wood, I've had maybe one colony in my Tyree Icefire Agonata, which is, you know, got a little pissed off, and you know, I lost a little bit of that, but you know, I've still got a good chunk of that and a few frags that are in the system, so I didn't totally lose it. But you know, other than that, everything is really pretty darn healthy. What What also does that potentially say to us in terms of cryptic sumps? You know, I don't know how much experience you have in terms of working with cryptic sumps. This is the first time I've ever utilized a cryptic sump, but just the concept to me makes a lot of sense in terms of the more area that you could have for bacteria to colonize in the better. So I think for me, it's been working.
Yeah, it's you know, an idea that's been proposed by a lot of really smart people in the hobby, and put to work by many of them. I haven't done any systematic testing of cryptic sumps, and it's not something I've deliberately explored myself. I'll say that all of my sumps have what I think of as a cryptic area in them.
Yeah.
You know, a big area of live rock that's not lit at all. You know, it's dark, and parts of it have quite low flow. But I think that people who really get into cryptic sumps do it a bit more deliberately than I have. Yeah, I'm curious about yours. What did you do with the cryptic sump beyond what I just described? That is just a dark corner of your sump.
Yeah, you know, like I mentioned in the beginning, it's a 2 foot by 2 foot by 2 foot polyurethane tank cube that you know, so it's all it's black, so there's absolutely no light that gets into it whatsoever. I have I've got about 110 pounds of the Haitian live rock in there, and I don't do a darn thing to it. I just basically I can't remember who, but somebody recommended this this very simple overflow device that you can attach to the drain line on the inside. So it's just got a little screen on the top. Maybe it's you know, it's like a little rectangle shape that I would say is like probably 2 inches wide by 6 inches long, and it's got a screen on the top. So before the water goes into the drain, it goes through that little screen. But there's really not anything in there to screen out. You know, there's nothing. You know, I'll look at it every now and then, but there's really nothing that it's catching because there's no algae in there. There's no nothing. So.
How about flow rate? Is your whole turnover going through it, or is it kind of a...
No, I've got I think what I've got on there is a Mag 5 pump. I want to say it's about 400 gallons per hour. And it was definitely complicated to plumb it into my existing sump. You know, I basically have the return pump in the sump, and so that is near my other return pumps, so it's a separate pump. And then what I did was the drain line. This was tricky. I have a Royal Exclusiv Dreambox, and it's hard plumbed. So I have I've got several different drains, and so I spliced it into one of those PVC drains, which was some very technical PVC work.
Yeah, that sounds.
And I was a little I was worried because I've never done that before, and I didn't know how it was going to impact the rest of the system. So it's a bit of a Frankenstein setup in terms of the plumbing and the way it's working. But knock on wood, so far so good.
Yeah, cool. So have you opened it up to see? Do you have a massive growth of sponges in there?
I gotta take a really closer look. I think I do have. There is a lot of. There does seem to be a lot of life in there, but I gotta take a much closer look and
yeah, that's one of the things that I think is really interesting and potentially powerful about cryptic sumps is getting a high biomass of sponge growing in there, because they're such effective filterers. You know, they're going to interact with the bacterial community and pull nutrients out of the water, pull bacteria out of the water. Yeah, and eventually I would expect quite a high biomass to be in there.
Yeah, that's interesting because my nutrients in that tank are not very high, and I think one reason is because the corals were certainly acting as absorbing some of the nitrates and the phosphates in that system. I did not have any. I used to have a Cato reactor going, and I took that offline, and I basically have been dosing bacteria in that system. I did recently put the Cato reactor back online, but instead of putting Cato in there, I put some screening material, and I've turned it into a do-it-yourself algae scrubber. So it's a
Cool.
it's a reactor, but it's turned into a scrubber. So
Nice.
it's doing its job. But that's interesting because my nitrates in that system are around 2.5 parts per million, and my phosphates have been pretty close to 0. And that's
gotcha.
that's you know, so I've been dosing a lot of phosphate to keep the phosphate up.
Yeah. Well, this is worth talking about. So that's interesting. Very low nutrients, but you have macroalgal growth that is probably controlling the nutrients. And I'm hearing that right?
Yeah, and I think also the bacteria dosing.
Yeah. And so if I recall right, of course we got the results here, but I believe you've pretty consistently had lower nitrifying communities than many tanks. So I think
should I show the nitrifying ammonia nitrite?
Yeah, that would be great. So we don't have to go off my memory. Hey, it looks like my memory was not very accurate. Yeah, no, you had pretty typical nitrifying communities.
Yeah, so I'm looking at I'm showing the ammonia.
Yep. Yeah,
oxidizing microbes.
Yeah, so it looks like I have in front of me the. Sorry, actually, let me pull up the one that you made. That'll be better.
Yeah.
Because you had them all side by side.
James Scott, where did I get the black box for this cryptic sump? You know, I did a video about the cryptic sump, so I think if you just search that, or else you could even DM me. I could send you that that link. Unless I could find it right now and put it in the chat. Hang on one second. See what I could do here. We're both searching there, Eli.
Yeah, and you know what? I think I do have a update to point out here. So it looks like maybe when you put this together, you may recall that the pre-test, the first time we ran that sample, we didn't get as much data as I would like.
Yes.
That is just the number of DNA sequences wasn't as high as I would like. So we reran that one, and that one was successful in rerunning it. So if you look at the updated one, it actually shows a higher nitrifying community than what is shown in your combined slide. I hadn't realized that until just this moment. It actually looks very similar to the post-test. The pre-test community of nitrifiers looks very similar to the post-test. If you look at the updated,
are we looking at the ammonia oxidizing microbes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. Both groups, the ammonia oxidizing microbes and the nitrite oxidizing microbes. So
Gotcha.
the combined figure that you're showing kind of suggests that it increased, right?
Right. So what does the color coding mean? You know, so I see in the pre-test it's kind of like that that mustard color, gold color, and then it's red, and then it's green.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm generally trying to go with the color scheme of, you know, green is good and red is bad and yellow is in between. So green for ammonia oxidizing microbes indicates that you have a high enough level. Off the top of my head, I don't remember where I drew the threshold, but you can see that the value, that is the threshold for what makes it green versus red. But you can see that the value, the level of this group in your post-test, that is your frequency number, is within the normal range. So that typical range of numbers that's shown right next to it, that's the 10th to the 90th percentile. Right?
So,
and yours is sort of right in the middle of that. So a very normal level of ammonia.
Hey, Amanda. Hey, Amanda, what's happening? So Amanda Meckley is wondering, you know, what determines the typical range of a reef tank? How is that determined? It's based off of the norms in your database?
Great. Yeah, important question. Yeah. So it's based on what's in the database with some careful filtering for data quality. So, you know, we have a large number of samples in the database, and they're not all normal reef tanks. Some of them are experimental tanks. Some of them aren't reef tanks at all. So we kick out things that aren't normal. You know, we know these are not normal. We also kick out samples that we didn't get good data for. You know, there's occasional failed samples in the database. So after trimming all that stuff out, we have this data set now of just the high quality data from normal healthy reef tanks. that's the data set that I use to determine all of these kind of normal things in the report. So when we compare to the normal community, that's the database that we're looking at. When we compare to the range of a particular level, like ammonia oxidizers, that's where we get that range.
So, Eli, what does this say then? So basically, for the nitrifying community, I'm also going to look at the one for nitrite, and it looks like that was in the green for all three of them. But you know, going back to the nitrifying community for the ammonia oxidizing microbes, what does that say in terms of, you know, before I did this whole thing, you know, it was I guess kind of like in a neutral zone, and then it got, you know, with the Rubbermaid tub, it was like in this red zone, but then post everything, it seems to have improved. How would you just?
Well, so that's,
go ahead.
That's the clarification I need to make, is that the that yellow coded one that you're looking at, the pre-test that's yellow coded, that was based on low coverage data.
Okay.
And so I'm sorry, I should have caught this before our call today. I'm looking here at the full reports, which are in your folder on the website. Yeah. And so I happened to notice that there was this updated one, right? And I pulled that. So the real story, if you pull up that updated one, you'll see that it actually has almost an identical level. It's 0.021. That's the level of ammonia oxidizing in the pre-test for the updated data set. Okay. And boy, that's almost exactly the same number, right? At your post-test, we have 0.025. Right. Very, very similar level. About 2% of the community is ammonia oxidizers, both pre and post-test, which I think makes a lot more sense. It's a lot more intuitive than the result that we would have to try to understand how could it be increasing.
Right.
By the same
a couple of quick questions from the viewers. Rashindra Bachu, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, hopefully. How long would a sample be good shipping from Trinidad and Tobago? Could they do that?
Yeah, important question. So the way that we have people ship samples is as a sterilized and dried filter. So it's really kind of a pretty stable material at that point. If you were to ship me water, it wouldn't last even within the US. You know, but the way that we take these samples, yeah, they're quite stable. Of course, that relies on you, you know, following the instructions properly, taking the sample and preserving it properly. But in principle, I don't have concerns within the time span of, say, a few weeks. When we get the samples back here in the lab, I pop them in the freezer because it can't hurt. Freezer is always best for long-term storage. And I advise clients to also store your samples in the freezer if you're hanging on to them for a few days before you ship them. But I'm not worried at all about a couple of weeks during shipping. Yeah.
So Amanda's got another question. Does Eli have the ability to input typical range based on specific systems? I'm not exactly sure.
So maybe she's thinking of sort of what's the typical range for a reef tank? What's the typical range for a fowler? What's the typical range for a frag tank versus a...
They also, Amanda and Chris Meckley, they own ACI Aquaculture, which is a commercial coral farming operation down in Florida. So maybe perhaps she's wondering whether there can be, I guess, norms for commercial operations.
Yeah. I would say that in principle, if we have enough of them in the database, in principle, something like that is possible. It is not at all implemented right now. You know, right now I don't have like a checkbox you can choose, compare me to this kind of tank or compare me to that kind of tank. But in principle, the data are there and we could ask those kind of questions. Let's say it's on the to-do list. Yeah.
So a couple of questions also about your live reef rubble and sand. Alec Fellows is wondering, would your live reef rubble have a benefit to a 20-gallon reef tank that has been running 7 months? Started with rock pulled from my local fish store sump and carob seed live sand. And
Gotcha.
And then there's another question from James Scott, just wants you to talk more about the live sand. So maybe, given that we've been talking about my situation, could you, I guess, debrief everybody on those two products?
I'm seeing your situation as pretty different than the proposal that we just heard. That is, you had this mature microbial community in your tank, and you cultivated that community on some additional rock. Is that a fair way of thinking about it? In other words, you're transferring an existing community.
Right. I wanted to maintain or possibly augment what I had.
Yeah. And so what I'm hearing from this question is more about kind of enhancing, supplementing a community. So talking about supplementing a community, my suggestion, if you have an existing tank, is to use live sand or mud to supplement the community. And it's not that I don't think live reef rubble will work. I think it will. We don't have a solid data set demonstrating that live reef rubble or any other live rock, when added to a tank, will make a big difference in that community. My prediction is it will. And I think many of us have done things like this and seen anecdotal results. But the experiments we've done show that live sand and mud, if you add them to an existing established tank, will have quite a dramatic effect on the community. In contrast, if you're starting a tank, we do have good data showing that live rock, and specifically the same material that we sell, that we use for our live reef rubble, has a really dramatic effect on establishing a new community in a tank. So I'm not saying it won't work. We sell lots of live reef rubble to people who want to use it for that purpose, and I think it's a good use of it. I'm just trying to be careful about saying what I have evidence for. And what I have evidence for is live sand and mud will help an established tank, and live rock or rubble will help a new tank. It may be, and probably is, that both materials are useful in both situations.
Gotcha. So okay, let's look at some more of the data there, Eli. And
Sure,
in terms of so there's all this data about diversity and balance. Is there anything? I'm showing the diversity data pre-test, Rubbermaid, and post-test. Is there anything that we haven't really kind of touched on?
Well, there's one. You've described a great success in this story. Breaking down a tank, rebooting it in a new tank. I think many of us have done something like that, whether it's transferring to a new tank or replacing.
Oh, I've done that, and I've screwed it up,
Right. Yeah, it can go really bad, right? So I think you've told a great success story here, and I think one piece that we haven't talked about is what's missing. That is, we found no sign of any pathogens in your tank.
Yeah, let me show the coral pathogens.
Yeah, so he's got these great, empty tables across the board, and that's the known coral pathogens. That's the one people have written papers about and proven. This thing is a coral pathogen. It causes this.
Now, I thought
disease.
I had a decent concentration of the Vibrio, that one Vibrio in the composition, community composition analysis.
So the family, at the family level, absolutely, you've got a lot of Vibrio naceae, but it turns out not to be the pathogenic types.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Right? So that's a family, and I haven't put together a list of the species from yours. Unfortunately, most of the Vibrios that show up in our samples are not identified to the species level. It's a very, very diverse family, and so we find them. They're exactly the same DNA sequence that some other researcher has found before, and we find it in your tank. But that thing doesn't have a species name. It's Vibrio species, right? That's the case for most of the stuff in yours. They're not known pathogens. So yeah, that table that you're showing, that says none of the known pathogens are there. But what I'm even more struck by is none of the suspected pathogens showed up in your tank either. So this Caribbean disease, SCTLD, stony coral tissue loss disease, some of these pathogens are suspected pathogens that are associated with this disease. They're quite prevalent in the hobby. 15 to 20% of tanks have any one of these pathogens. That is, you could make that statement for each pathogen on the list. Your tank didn't have any of them. And so when we talk about the success of your story, transferring both the corals and the microbiome from one tank to another, important to recognize that feature. You know, another tank that was full of coral pathogens or suspected pathogens might have seen much more mortality in the corals during all the stress.
So I'm sure we talked about this, you know, when you were on a couple times before, but can you just review with us, Eli, in terms of how, you know, it is possible to pick up one of these coral pathogens, and then you know, the second part of my question would be how to treat them.
Yeah. So coral pathogens are often transmitted in water. Certainly, I guess it goes without saying, if you buy a chunk of coral, that coral frag could have in it a coral pathogen. But in fact, even just the water, right? Just the water clinging to rocks, the water associated with the coral mucus. A drop of water from that bag could have coral pathogens in it. So they're both surface or water associated. What can we do about them? Well, we have a huge range of tools for killing bacteria, but the problem is killing specific bacteria, right? And so I'm not generally a fan of widespread use of antibiotics as a preventative measure. So I'm not advocating that people, nuke their tanks with antibiotics. I'm not advocating that they do strong antibiotic dips on every coral frag that they ever buy. But what I would say, let's be aware of the prevalence of bacterial coral pathogens in the hobby. The SCTLD bugs are very prevalent. All the others less so. But we have found a handful of other.
So you call them bugs? I mean, that's just they're bacteria, though.
Yeah, just colloquially, informally, bugs. Yeah. So they're all members of the Rhodobacteriaceae. These SCTLD associated bacteria. That is their surface, their biofilm community. So they could come in on a rock, and we have seen them occasionally in batches of live rock. We've seen coral pathogens show up in batches of live rock that don't have any visible corals in them, but there's a coral pathogen in the water. And
is pretty much the signs that you might perhaps have one of these pathogens, RTN, STN in terms of aquaphora?
So the SCTLD, we don't have a really good idea of the range of corals that it affects. This is a funny, kind of unfortunate lack of intersection between the hobby and the research. So the research on this disease is all in the Caribbean, and there are no Caribbean corals in the hobby. I mean, by law, there cannot be any Caribbean corals in the hobby. And so, there's no papers published on the corals that we care about and this disease. We're really breaking new ground here when we even ask the question, can this bacterium affect this coral? Because it's not an issue that's happening out there in the research world. Yeah, I lost my train of thought.
Well, we got a couple other questions here, but
good.
Real Slacker is wondering, does UV or ozone have a dramatic effect on these pathogens?
So UV, ozone, I don't know much about because we don't have enough people enough samples in our database that have ozone in use to be able to ask those questions. But UV we've looked at pretty extensively because it's a great case where lots of people use UV and lots of people don't use UV. So we have a nice database to compare the two and groups.
On my system, I use UV.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
And so I would love to know what's different about the UV on your system versus other systems. It's got to be something about the combination of the power, right? The number of watts and the flow rate, and something about the plumbing,
Yeah, there's a lot of variables when you're using UV, there really are.
Yeah. So across the database, without knowing any of those variables, just simply putting every every sample into it's UV plus or UV minus. There's a huge effect of UV on the microbial community as a whole. And the best place to see it is the Pelagibacteriaceae, this pink group that showed up. It showed up in your samples, both pre and post. Actually, more of it post than in the pre-sample, if I recall.
Which one, Eli? Which group?
Well, let me pull these up and make sure I'm remembering correctly.
I think I had a lot more in the pre, the pink.
It's a pink one. Is it more in the pre? No, so we're looking for the light pink one.
Oh, okay, the light pink one. I'm sorry.
Yep, the pink purple one at the bottom is Vibrio-Naceae.
Gotcha.
This kind of pale pink one that should be kind of in the middle of the bar.
Gotcha.
Shows up very low levels in your pre,
Yep.
but in your post, it shows up at higher levels, still lower than normal, but high,
Yep.
or high enough to detect. Right, it's there. So reason I focus in on this group here is just because if you're talking about effects of UV, that's by far the biggest effect of UV we see is a 20-fold reduction on average in the level of Pelagibacteriaceae. And in fact, it really is more striking than that. It's over 90% of tanks that use UV have no detectable members of this family. Now that family is the most abundant on a natural reef, and in mature reef tanks, it often rises to be the dominant family. So that's a big impact on the community. So I'm that's one of the things that I like to point out when the subject of UV comes up anytime is it has a huge impact on the community, and some of that impact may not be what you're trying for.
Right.
Now, does it help with pathogens and parasites? I think there's a lot of people who have been in the hobby longer than me who have had, measurable success using it to knock out some of the parasites. And so I don't want to step in and say, well, that can't be true. I mean, you've got people with years of experience saying it worked for them. Here's what I'll say. We find both parasites and pathogens in systems that are using UV. I haven't done an analysis to say, is it a higher or lower, but higher or lower level, but it's certainly not the case that if you have UV in your system, there's never any pathogens or parasites. We often do see them showing up in systems with UV. I say use it if you feel that your system calls for it. If you as a hobbyist find it a useful tool, you have some experience saying that it'll help you with whatever disease you're dealing with, I say use that tool. But I just like to bring up the side effects. It has a big impact on the microbial community, so using it preventatively may not be the best idea.
Do you have any?
Certainly not if you want a natural microbial community.
Do you have any data or any conclusions that you could draw from systems that use UV in terms of fish pathogens? Is it reducing the fish pathogens? I mean, that's one of the reasons why I'm using UV. Is like my understanding is that it will help to on that front a little bit.
Are you thinking parasites or pathogens now? That is bacteria or non-bacterial?
I guess anything free floating that can be something that could impact the fish.
Yeah. So I mean, I definitely see both categories in tanks that are using UV. That is, I see fish bacterial pathogens. Just today, sent out an email about that. There was one sample that had that. Guy was using UV and had 2 fish pathogens in his sample. So, and I've certainly seen some cases where they have something like ick, well-known cryptocarian, well-known parasite in the sample, and they're using UV. But again, I don't want to make some claim that it doesn't reduce levels because I haven't done the experiment to monitor over time what effect.
Yeah, I've had some mysterious losses in my tank with fish over the last I want to say 6 to 8 months. I used to have 3 wrasses in that tank, and I lost all 3. Just kind of over time, and it started with like a kind of like color fading, and then they perished. So I think I lost. I also lost a sailfin tank, kind of like a similar type of situation where it was just it lost its color, and then kind of slowly but surely it died off, and
Yeah.
So I don't know. I guess there's definitely some sort of pathogen in there that impacted those fish, but I haven't had any losses in the last, I want to
Yeah.
say, 30 to 60 days.
Yeah. Yeah. And so we sure didn't see any bacterial pathogens in your tank. I was looking back at your record, and it looks like we did test your tank prior to all of this, right? And we did run a tank DNA test on your tank before all of
Right.
this. I don't remember exactly where that falls in the timetable, but it's before this stuff. And I recall, didn't we find an unusual
Right.
parasite?
Yeah, you did. Right.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah. I think that was the only parasite that we saw in your sample. But it's a really odd one. And maybe this is a good time to segue into that other discussion about the unexpected mysterious parasites that show up. Yeah, so we didn't find ick in your sample, right? We didn't find any of the usual. But what we found was this thing called a myxozoan. Myxozoans are a complete oddball. They turn out to be a member of the cnidarians. That is the group that is anemones, jellyfish, and all these other corals, right? But myxozoans, they're microscopic. So think of it as a microscopic jellyfish that lives inside fish blood. That's what it is, an internal parasite of fish. And they have a complex life cycle, at least some of them do, where they go from a fish host to a worm host, and then back to the fish host. And so that's a question that I have for this new observation. I've never read about myxozoans in the hobby, but we've seen them in a half dozen tanks now. It's a question for this new observation. Are we seeing a worm infection or a fish infection? We know this species infects both worms and fish, but in your tank was it a worm infection or a fish infection? I don't think we ever swabbed any of your fish, did we?
No.
Yeah.
No.
That's what I'm trying to get people to do. If they have one of these really interesting new parasites, like, let's swab the fish and confirm that, this parasite infects this fish, because often we don't know.
Right, and we didn't see that in the latest test, right? You didn't see that fish pathogen.
So looking at your record here, and forgive me, I'll look back to make sure I'm saying the right thing. I only see one time that we've done a tank DNA test.
Right. We didn't do the tank DNA,
and that was October of 2021.
Yeah, right. Gotcha.
So yeah, these parasites, because they're eukaryotes, they show up only on the tank DNA test. It's two totally different processes in the lab to analyze the prokaryotes versus the eukaryotes. So perhaps that contributed to some of the fish deaths that you're talking about.
Yeah. Jonathan Mills, thank you so much for that super chat. His question is, what is a rough time it takes to get a similar level of biodiversity of mature tanks, starting with dry rock, but adding live sand, mud, rubble? Months, years?
Yeah. Great. So this was, I guess, a couple of things I want to say about this. First, when I started in the hobby as a coral biologist, thinking I was going to come in and have clean tanks with just my coral in it, I failed spectacularly, like every other hobbyist who tries to start a sterile tank. So I entered this as a skeptic about live rock. I thought this was some voodoo, some snake oil they were selling, and I pretty quickly was convinced by experience that there was something to it, that this mattered. I give that background just to say that really I was a skeptic at the beginning, and I had to be convinced by the data. So what were the data? Well, the first piece of data I had was the observation that we've all had, where we try it both ways and it works one way. The other piece of data was, when I first set up the lab and first started AquaBiomics, I did this series of experiments with, I think exactly what the caller is asking about here. Sorry, I don't know what we call them in this context.
The viewer.
The person with the question, the viewer, there you go. So I started these tanks in a variety of ways, dry rock or dry rock with some seeded material, some live reef rubble. And really I used exactly the same material that we're using to prepare live reef rubble now. And we got a comparable level of diversity within 1 month. So I mean, I can put a number on it with those conditions around it, right? With this material in these kind of tanks, they were 20-gallon tanks, replicated experimental 20-gallon tanks, and we started them with, I don't remember the amount of live reef rubble, but it was a relatively small amount. The idea was to seed it, not to create an aquascape, you know. And yeah, within a month we got diversity that was on par with an established tank. It was about the median, that is about the average for an established tank after about a month. We also got measurable levels of both ammonia and nitrite oxidizers. So to me, that was like, okay, we're good. We've got the average diversity and we've got a complete nitrifying community.
Gotcha. A couple more questions here from Mike Hopla. This is going back to what we're talking about in terms of potentially preventing pathogens from entering the tank, coral pathogens.
Yeah.
What about using ChemiClean dips to help fight these pathogens? Would that be something that you could do without killing off the beneficial bacteria?
So, the rumor is that is an antibiotic, right? Is it erythromycin?
Yes, that is the scuttlebutt.
Yeah, yeah. And so I haven't seen the data myself, but so many people who know about this stuff believe that I'm ready to take it. It makes sense based on what it does in tanks, right? So I think dose matters with all of these things, and perhaps ChemiClean, perhaps the manufacturers have done enough testing that we collectively can say that that's a safe dose, what they're recommending. I personally don't have the experience with ChemiClean to say yes or no, whether to use it in any context. I just don't have the experience, but I know that there's a lot of good experience in the hobby with it.
I think my head's, go ahead, you were going to finish.
As an antibiotic, I guess I just wanted to finish by saying, if we assume the rumor is true, that it is in fact an antibiotic at some safe dose, then I think it's a reasonable suggestion, right, to use that as a dip. And I guess I just wanted to broaden it a bit to say that I think that an appropriate antibiotic at an appropriate dose is a generally reasonable thing to do for a dip. I wouldn't like to see people doing that as a treatment to the whole tank.
Yeah.
Because I think you run the risk of introducing antibiotic resistant or selecting for antibiotic resistance. But a safe dose of an appropriate antibiotic as a dip, I think this is a strategy that makes sense.
I think my only concern about doing that is that, whenever I bring in a new frag, SPS frag, I'll do a dip in potassium chloride. So to make sure that it doesn't have any aquamarine flatworms on it.
Right.
But then I would be concerned about putting the frag through another dip, and stressing out that coral with too much dipping. I guess that's something that we would have to see by experimenting in terms of whether or not the frags would get really pissed off. But I guess that would be one of my concerns.
Yeah, and I share that concern. I mean, coming from the coral side of things, absolutely, I share that concern. My own practice is to be pretty gentle with dips. I like potassium chloride as my go-to safe coral dip.
It's awesome.
I mean, I have not lost corals from this dip. For tougher corals, zoas, I'm a fan of hydrogen peroxide, and I'll hit them with a 50%, 50-50 mixture of 3%, that is the off-the-shelf hydrogen peroxide, mixed 50-50 with seawater. I will soak zoas in that for 15 to 30 minutes, and they're fine.
Wow.
And it's, I mean, that stuff's horrific. But of course, I've never put an SPS in that.
Right. Going back to potassium chloride, I've talked about this before. That it's there's so many benefits to it. One, it's not potentially hazardous to your health, like the Bayer and insecticide is. Two, it's clear, so you can see any pests that are popping off. But just the whole concept in terms of increasing the I guess it's kind of like sucking the there's a whole scientific terminology in terms of it's basically the reverse of an osmotic shock, is my understanding. Is
Yeah.
you're sucking
Yeah,
the fluid out of the cells or something like that with this this dip. But I even had great success using it to eradicate. I think they're called acol flatworms.
Okay. Yeah.
From Goniopora and Alveopora, which I had been hitting those things with, you know, pretty much every, not every coral dip. I had a couple of coral dips. Coral RX, I think, was one of them, and there was another coral dip that I was using to try to get rid of these flatworms, these like red planaria like flatworms, and nothing was really, you know, it was knocking back maybe 75%, but you know the rest were just kind of hiding inside the coral skeleton. But man, the KCL, that stuff just really eliminated it. I mean, it's just, I guess they had nowhere to hide from the osmotic shock.
Yeah, and you know, when you're using a safe dip like that, you can afford to leave it in there and, you know, blow some current on it, right? And if you're dealing with a dip that stresses the coral out more, you can't afford that kind of time and handling, you know.
Here's an interesting question from NSB Reefs. What's the best way to reboot your microbiome?
Well, are we thinking about I guess I'll interpret the question myself. So we're thinking about taking an existing tank and enhancing the microbiome in some way, as compared to sort of nuking it and starting over. I guess that's the distinction that I want to. Yeah. That's the question I want to ask. Is are we nuking it, sterilizing it, or are we talking about preserving what we have and adding to it, supplementing it?
Let's go with that, with the latter there.
Yeah, preserve what you have and supplement it. So, you know, the data I have say that live sand and mud have a really big impact. So I saw this in a few ways. Okay, I saw that the nitrifying community was enhanced by doing this. The balance and diversity scores were enhanced, and the this group that I'm always talking about, the Pelagibacteriaceae, this dominant group, that group was enhanced by the addition of this material. So several different ways of looking at the community, and all of them improved just by taking live sand and mud, putting it in in my case, the experiment I did, I put it in a high flow area of the sump. My goal was, let's spread this stuff around as much as possible. Get it suspended in the water and let it circulate through the tank. And that had a very big effect on the community.
Here's an interesting question from Bill Carlson. I'm not exactly sure what to make of this question, but I'm going to hit you up with it. Has Eli identified a healthy ratio of certain bacteria? Might that vary based on which corals one might have? And does Eli ever think about bringing in some unusual bacteria not normally found in tanks? So actually, I guess infusing tanks with a certain strain of bacteria, maybe not normally in those tanks.
Yeah. So, you know, what is the optimum microbial community? I mean, that's one way of thinking about this question, talking about this ratio of one bacterium to another. Sounds like we're talking about what's the ideal community. And I think in a lot of ways, no, I don't have that answer, and nobody has that answer.
What are the manufacturers of the bottle bacteria? What are they basing those decisions off? I mean, obviously they're using certain strains in those bottles, and I don't think all of them are forthcoming in terms of what strains they're in those bottles.
Right. I would say very few of them label what's in the bottles. So I haven't done an extensive survey. You know, there's probably manufacturers. I've never tested any of their products. You know, but I've tested a dozen or more different bacterial products on the market. Here's what I'll say about them. The components of bottled bacterial products are not the components of a reef tank microbiome. If we're drawing a Venn diagram, there's little intersection between those two circles. The viewer can interpret that as they wish. Adding these products to your tank has an effect on the microbiome of your tank. I've seen these effects over and over, to the point where I can now The Fusobacteriaceae, a common family of bacteria, shows up as purple on the community plot. Shows up at very low levels in the typical tank. If you dose most bacterial products, you often will see a bloom, an increase of the Fusobacteriaceae. They aren't components of what's in the bottle, but they bloom when you put the bottle in your tank. I think a lot of the effects that we see from bottled bacterial products are happening from the nutrients that come along with them. You know, it's a bottle with living bacterial cells in it, and also some nutrients that will keep those bacteria alive. And when you put all that stuff in your tank, it doesn't just fuel those bacteria, it also gets chewed up by other bacteria. So yeah, a couple of things I said there I want to reiterate. The stuff that's in the bottle, we don't see it when we look at the tank in general across the products I've looked at. And the stuff that does bloom in tanks that are dosed with bottled bacterial products in general, the stuff that does bloom is not stuff that came from the bottle. So again, I think that they have effects, but I would not say that the manufacturers are going out and saying, well, what grows in a tank? Let me try to cultivate a normal bacterial community. It seems that they're cultivating bacteria that have specific effects. This bacteria will chew up ammonia. This bacteria will degrade polysaccharides that make up algal cell walls, and so it'll help clean up detritus. And so I'm not trying to make a claim that it's snake oil. You know, these things have effects, but the effects, in my view, based on the data I've seen, those effects are not based on inoculating bacteria into your tank, which then become a colony. Rather, it's based on adding bacteria to your tank that do something, and also adding nutrients to your tank that fuel the growth of some bacteria.
So, you know, obviously there's a lot of folks out there. I dose bacteria. I think I mentioned I dose bacteria, sure. and there's a lot of other folks that do dose bacteria to mature reef tanks.
Yep.
What? Well, I guess my question to you is: do you dose bacteria to your tanks?
No, and I'll come out and say that in my opinion, the products are overused in the hobby. I think that there is a place for them, and I'm enthusiastic for experimentation. Everybody should experiment in whatever way they want to. In my opinion, they are overused in the hobby, and in established tanks is probably not the place where I would recommend using them. I see a place for them in starting a tank. It's not how I start tanks, but especially for people who are focused on fish, I can see a reason for them in establishing tanks. I can see a reason for them in remediating tanks that have algal, detritus issues, and algal growth issues. I know people have had success with them there. But if you're looking to maintain the microbial community in your tank, I don't think there's good data saying that they are the way to do it. Do they hurt? I don't think so. And I do think they have effects. They contain nutrients, and they do contain living cells. The community that's growing in your tank, I mean, we've looked at your data, and the community that's growing in your tank does not look like the community in a bottle.
Right.
Yeah.
What about the fact that, I think this is a scientific fact, that corals do consume bacteria, correct?
Yeah, and it's contentious. You'll get coral biologists arguing about it, but yes, I think there's good evidence for it. We know very little about what kind of bacteria they like to eat, but I think there is some good evidence from radio labeling experiments that they eat bacteria. They get nutrients from bacteria. So I think that's an entirely reasonable theory. It's, it makes sense to operate under that theory and to test that idea. Perhaps it is beneficial as a coral food.
Yeah, that was one of the reasons why I decided to keep dosing bacteria. Initially when I started dosing bacteria was to help reduce nutrients like nitrates and phosphates. I wanted to kind of like get off of macro and Chaeto. I was having a lot of experiences where Chaeto was crashing. It was a little frustrating. So I was
Yeah.
able to actually, swap out the Cato for the bacteria dosing, and that was working,
Cool.
for me. So I
Yeah.
think that part you mentioned in terms of helping to control detritus is
Yeah.
is definitely been a plus for me.
Yeah. And that's, that application of it seems to me biologically sound, right? Because you're adding live bacteria that have an activity. They themselves can chew up, can take up nutrients. And the nutrients you're adding is also a form of carbon dosing, right? So it's boosting bacterial growth and, again, getting nutrient uptake. So yeah, I think that's totally plausible. The ones I'm skeptical about are the ones that want to increase diversity by adding a bottle, and that bottle might have 3 types of bacteria in it. I'm like, that's probably not going to increase your diversity by a lot.
What about you mentioned bottled bacteria? That's liquid bacteria. There's other companies that have dry bacteria. Any thoughts in terms of dry versus bottled liquid bacteria?
Yeah, really interesting concept. I've only come across it recently, and I haven't done any testing with it. I'll say that, I mean, of course, it's biologically plausible. It is a way that you can preserve bacteria. In fact, some of the bacterial stock companies, when you're ordering bacteria for research, some types of bacteria, that's how they send it to you, is basically as a powder. Um, I want to point out that it really restricts what groups. So only some groups of bacteria can form spores. But for those groups of bacteria, it should be a great way of doing
Yeah,
it.
Amanda Meckley mentions Remediate, which is a dry bacteria from Captivate Aquaculture, which is what I've been using the last few months. And I think one of the big reasons for me is I live in a cold area of Vermont in the wintertime. And so, with the liquid bacteria, that was my fear. Was getting into a situation where it might be too cold to ship the bottled bacteria for me. So
Yeah.
that's certainly
Yeah.
one advantage.
I think that makes a lot of sense, because no matter what the seller claims, you're not ever really confident about how was that liquid handled in between the factory and your door. And a powder form should be more stable. I'll tell you, my skepticism about all these things could be solved if we all just tested more of them, because in my experience, most of the bacterial types that are in these products are well-studied types. Now, that's not universally true. Some of them are completely, I can't find a match anywhere, but they're generally well-studied types, classified down to the species level. And so if we had a product and we knew it was this one species, there would be a wealth of literature that we could read about and say, well, I'm convinced it really will have that activity because there's research papers showing that it does.
Well,
so we need more ingredients listed.
yeah, I think for manufacturers to be a lot more forthcoming in terms of what's in their products would certainly be a big benefit to all of us. And I understand in terms of trying to protect the secret sauce there, and not wanting to kind of give that away. But by the same token, I think full disclosure is something that me as a hobbyist would like to certainly see more of.
Yeah, and I think there's a middle ground. I think there's room for manufacturers to preserve their secret sauce while also giving something. Maybe the secret sauce is how you grow and preserve those bacteria to get them to us, right? I don't know. I don't do this, but I'm sure there are tricks to it, right? Maybe you can tell us the species and just keep all those other tricks to yourself.
You're a scientific guy. I've talked about this before, but I would love to see a third party, like a body out there in the hobby, where basically would be able to certify the methodologies that manufacturers use to make their products, and kind of like have that stamp of approval, and that
would be really
something of that nature. And I know that sort of thing costs a lot of money, but
right.
it would be nice to be able to have some sort of organization out there that can kind of validate, right, what the manufacturers are doing, and say that their process is valid and meets the rigors of yeah.
Yeah, I can envision it at lots of levels, you know, from the chemical components of products that you're asked to dose in your aquarium to the biological components, like what kind of bacteria is in this bottle, all the way up to the livestock. I mean, I can imagine genetic certification. Yes, this really is this species.
Oh, that would be awesome.
Yeah. Of course, you know, we're not going to do this with, you know, chromis or something,
No.
right? A little cheap fish, but, you know, for some of the high-end corals, it could be, yeah, we could verify, is that really a Walt Disney or not?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Is that a knockoff?
That's a whole nother topic there, Eli. Let me tell you that much. The knockoff topic. So here's another fish pathogen question from Milton English. My tank came back negative for fish pathogens. I'm assuming he did a test with you guys. Yet I have losses.
I remember
fish that were emaciated, suggesting internal parasites. I want you to comment on that.
So, so he has observations that say there are sick fish in the tank, but we didn't find any parasites or pathogens on the test. Yeah. So without pulling up his results and, you know, re-reviewing them, I will say it's not the only time we've heard that. You know, it is possible to have a sick fish, and yet we don't find any known parasites or pathogens on the test. It raises a few possibilities. You know, one possibility is the one that I don't want to think about, but, you know, let's acknowledge it. Perhaps it's there and we just couldn't detect it for some technical reason. And we could get into a discussion about, you know, what those possible technical reasons are and how we guard against them. But, you know, suffice it to say, we do our best to make these tests as sensitive as we know how, so that we will detect if it's present. But let's also consider this other possibility. There was a sick fish in the tank, but no DNA from that parasite got into the tube. Right? The swab that you sent me, or the filter that you sent me, or whatever, did not contain any of the DNA from that parasite or pathogen. And that's actually if things are working as they should, that's what I believe. You know, if it was in the sample, we should have detected it. And so how could that be? Well, the fact that there's an infected fish in the tank doesn't necessarily mean that the tank is infected. That is, that there is a population of that parasite or pathogen in the tank that is large enough to be detectable and dangerous. So I'm broadly raising this. Again, I don't know, Milton, if this is your case. I'd have to sit down and look at your specific results again. But broadly, you know, this is an option that I want the viewers to consider. Negative tests can be meaningful too. You know, if I tell you that you had enough, if I tell you that the sample worked at a technical level and we didn't find any parasites in it, then I'm convinced that really there were no parasites in that sample. Doesn't mean I'm arguing with you about your fish, right? Your fish may be very infected, but it just hasn't spread out to the rest of the tank. And I think this could be especially the case for some categories of parasites more so than others. So we find tons of urinema. This is obviously a very easy parasite to detect. We also find lots of cryptocarrion. Again, it's got to be just an easy one to detect because we see it so much. But there are a variety of worms that cause internal flukes, that cause internal infections that we have never seen in our tests. Perhaps it's because they're internal and thus just harder to sample. So I'm raising the possibility you can have an infected fish and not have an infected tank, but let's be sure about it. So what I'm trying to always follow up with these days, if you think that's your case, you think you've got an infected fish, but your test said your tank isn't infected, let's follow up and do a swab of the fish. Because in many cases we can, just by directly swabbing the fish and running that swab sample on a test, in many cases we can then find a parasite that we couldn't see the first time.
What's the best way to catch the fish in a reef tank?
I suck at this. so bad at this. Because I don't know how he does it. Man, for me, I have to take the tank apart, and it's terrible. I wish I had advice to give you, and I have none. I'm really bad at catching fish.
I used actually I used a fish acclimation box recently to catch a fish.
Nice.
I used it,
bait it in there, put some food in,
and it took me about 15 minutes. I tied up a piece of fishing string to the door, and the fish that I was looking to capture wandered right in, and I shut the door. I was like shocked. I was shocked.
Yeah.
I've also used small little fly fishing hooks that you crush the barb on. A little, put a little food on that. I've had success doing that as well.
That's great.
So Amanda's got another question for you, and we're going back to the bacteria again.
Yeah.
What did he find in bacterial levels when minor and trace elements were added? Any data regarding bacteria, community compositions if you're using traces versus not?
Yeah, I've got to say it's a question I haven't even asked of the database yet. In principle, it's a question I may be able to ask because I do have this question in the questionnaire dosing, like other people can write in there other things that they are dosing. So I don't have a checkbox. Are you dosing trace elements? Yes or no. But I have this place people could say I'm dosing trace elements. So I haven't looked at the database to ask the question, but the information is there that may allow me to. Yeah. I certainly expect iron's going to have an effect. That's well established. Some of the other minor components of seawater may also have measurable effects, and I just can't predict them.
Yep. All right, Eli. Well, listen, man. I think maybe we could wrap it up tonight. I don't want to keep you too much longer. Good. Any final thoughts in terms of the services that you guys provide? I mean, obviously you visit aquabiomics.com to go and get kind of jumpstart the whole process in terms of getting sampling. But
yeah, that's right. I guess I want to leave you with the idea that you and I were talking about earlier, Keith, about all these oddball, unexpected parasites that show up in these samples. So your tank, although we haven't gone into much today, did have that odd myxozoan parasite in it. We've seen that in some other tanks. We've seen some other parasites out there that we never expected to find. I'll just rattle off a couple real quick. It's a dinoflagellate, a toxic dinoflagellate, Pfiesteria. PF starts with PF, Pfiesteria. So this is
sounds like a badass one.
Yeah, it is. It's responsible for huge fish kills in nature. So they've studied it a lot on the east coast of the U.S. around the Chesapeake Bay. It was a big problem. Pfiesteria has showed up in several samples recently. I suspect it has entered the hobby supply chain at some level. Whether it's a persistent problem or not, I don't know. Maybe we'll never see it again after it kind of washes out through the supply chain. But my point in bringing these up, we've got myxozoans, we've got Pfiesteria, we've got another dinoflagellate, Piscodinium. So this is a lot like Amylodinium, the cause of velvet, but Piscodinium is only described in freshwater, causes a variety of velvet and also causes something called rust disease in freshwater fish. Turns out this showed up in a few samples, and I looked into the literature. There are known marine saltwater varieties of Piscodinium. So my point in throwing all of these out is, as we're looking at sick fish in our tanks, we kind of impose on them this framework of, well, it's going to be ick, it's going to be velvet, it's going to be uranema, right? We've got like a checklist. It's got to be one of these things. And what we're seeing is sometimes it is, sometimes people tell me, yeah, I've got ick, and I run their sample, and sure enough, cryptocarian. And other times it's something completely different. So I guess I just want to I want to share that with the viewers, that idea of being a little more flexible in your diagnosis. It may be what you think it is, or it may be something that nobody in the hobby even realized was in the hobby, like myxozoans or piscidinium. Yeah.
Like breaking new ground there. It's like
and that's where DNA sequencing is the only technology that would show us these things. So people are rightfully eager to get the results back and would like the results to be back much faster. DNA sequencing takes time, and sometimes we have these discussions about, should we move to other technologies like the rapid tests that people use for COVID, or a PCR test. And I always come back to this point that there's a place for all of those, and we probably will move to some of them at some point. But the value of DNA sequencing here is that we find this stuff that we weren't looking for, that we didn't even know was in the hobby.
So I guess the parallel to draw that, or the conclusion to draw with the getting results quicker, is that it potentially might compromise the accuracy of those results?
I'm going to say it would make them less complete. So these other technologies, if you take that at-home COVID test, it tells you really quickly whether you have COVID, but it doesn't tell you anything about all the other viruses out there. And that's exactly the case for, once we start using these technologies for testing fish diseases, we could do a qPCR test that would very quickly tell you if you have ick or not, but it would never tell you about all the other unknown stuff.
Gotcha.
That's an example. So yeah, it's a benefit of the technology that I wasn't sure how important or valuable it would be until we started testing so many tanks and seeing just what odd parasites are out there. It's not all ick. Yeah. A
little creepy.
Yeah.
All right, Eli. Well, listen, man. Thank you so much again for coming back on. I'm glad we didn't have any of the technical problems we had in the past. It seems like you've solved that issue.
I think we've got that one licked.
Got that one licked.
Thanks for this opportunity. Really appreciate it.
Cool. All right, folks. Well, that's going to do it for this show, and I want to thank Eli again for being on the live stream. And I also want to thank both Bulk Reef Supply and Ecotech Marine for being sponsors and supporting the show. And I also want to thank all you folks for tuning in and watching the episode. Finally, a big thank you to Paul, who is the moderator. And Paul is also the president of Boston Reefer Society, so please join and support your local reefing clubs. They are so important to the hobby. Paul did want me to mention that the Boston Reefer Society will be announcing a Joseph A. Venuti, Salty Old Dog was his handle, memorial scholarship to the attendees of the upcoming Frags Giving event on November 12th at the Topsfield Fairgrounds in Topsfield, Mass. I'm going to be there. This scholarship will be going towards students pursuing higher education in marine sciences, so it's really important. Joe was not only a longtime member of the Boston Reefer Society, but also a pioneer in the marine scene, as he was an importer in the late 60s and 70s when captive coral care was in its genesis. So Joe was the first one to administer new advice to the budding hobbyists. He was a generous gentleman that would literally give the shirt off his back, and he was well ahead of his time and has influenced many a hobbyist and set the course for the Boston Reefer Society as an educational organization. So this is a really, really important scholarship that is being announced. And as for the show itself, just want to remind you folks that all episodes of Rappin With ReefBum are available as podcasts on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Amazon. My next Rappin With ReefBum live stream will be next Thursday, November 12th at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time with hobbyist Paul Baldassano. And his reef tank is over 50 years old. I'd like to get some testing done on that one. Wouldn't you there, Eli?
We actually tested it early on, but he's had some, he's moved since then, and we've introduced a new test. So pitch it to him. Yeah, I'd love to. I'll send him a free test. I'd love to see what that 50-year-old tank looks like now.
We'll mention it to him. So yeah, if you want to catch the full upcoming schedule of guests on Rappin With ReefBum, just visit reefbum.com under the YouTube section. So until then, next time, be safe, be well, and later.
Thanks again.